Good morning. I'm Dara Brown in New York at MSNBC World Headquarters at 7 o'clock in the East, 4 out west, and here's what's happening. Cutting ties and raising questions. What a source told NBC News about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and the Russia probe. Person of the year or not? Why President Trump is saying thanks anyway to Time magazine. Coming to her defense, the First Daughters Club sends a message to the tabloids about leaving Malia Obama alone. And new this morning, another jab in the sparring between President Trump and Time magazine over the Person of the Year distinction. First, President Trump tweeted last night, Time magazine called to say that I was probably going to be named Person of the Year like last year, but I would have to agree to an interview and a major photo shoot. I said probably is no good and took a pass. Thanks anyway. Time magazine fired back later on Twitter, saying the president is incorrect about how we choose Person of the Year. Time does not comment on our choice until publication, which is December 6th. Meanwhile, the White House is downplaying a new development in the Russia investigation on whether ousted National Security Advisor Michael Flynn has cut a deal with Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team. NBC's Kristen Welker has more.
While President Trump hit the links with Tiger Woods in sunny Florida, the cloud of the Russia investigation is growing. A source familiar with the legal proceedings tells NBC News a lawyer for the president's ousted National Security Advisor Michael Flynn notified the president's legal team Wednesday that Flynn's team would no longer share information with them as they had been regularly doing. The change, first reported by the New York Times, could signal a significant shift in Flynn's cooperation with Special Counsel Robert Mueller.
What might it indicate?
It could mean that he's cooperating with prosecutors. On the other hand, it might just mean he's negotiating with them or trying to secure some favorable plea deal. In order to do that, though, he's going to have to demonstrate to prosecutors that he has some valuable information.
The White House is downplaying the development. One official telling NBC News, even if Flynn is cooperating with Mueller, there is no concern at the White House that Flynn will implicate the president. Mr. Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski.
There is no culpability or liability to the president because he didn't collude, cooperate, or coordinate with Russia in any way, shape, or form.
Earlier this month, NBC News reported that federal investigators had gathered enough evidence to bring charges in the Flynn investigation. Flynn is under scrutiny for his foreign lobbying work involving Russia and Turkey and was fired after just 24 days on the job. Although later, in an interview with Lester, President Trump praised Flynn.
He's, in my opinion, a very good person.
That was NBC's Kristen Welker reporting. And let's bring in Gabby Morangello, White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner, and Jonathan Allen, a national political reporter for NBC News Digital. Great to have you both this morning.
Good morning, Tara.
Jonathan, I want to start with you. What are you hearing about how the White House and others in President Trump's inner circle are processing this news about Mike Flynn?
Well, there's this great reporting we just heard from Kristen Welker. I think that the message that we're mostly hearing out of the White House and from allies like Corey Lewandowski is they're not worried about the president being implicated. I'm not sure what else they would say. I mean, the entire argument is that the president didn't do anything wrong. So the idea that Michael Flynn would be able to implicate him in wrongdoing is at odds with what the White House position is and what the president has done. That said, Kristen has also reported that there's, at least one person close to the White House who says, yeah, there is some concern about this. I think the big picture here is what we're seeing is the splitting or dividing of the interests of people who are involved in this. So the president's interests are not the same as Michael Flynn's interests, and they may not be the same as his own children's interests or Jared Kushner's interests. And so when you see these legal defense teams saying to each other, we can't cooperate anymore, it's because their clients have different interests.
And Gabby, what are you hearing about this, especially with Communications Director Hope Hicks now in the spotlight?
Well, there's a growing concern about these staff interviews that are taking place between Mueller and former and current White House officials. And I do think that there is some concern among White House staff over this this deal with Flynn. Flynn's lawyers had been in contact with the White House counsel, White House lawyers for President Trump, kind of sharing details of the ongoing investigation with them, and suddenly cut those ties and said they will no longer be able to share that information, which typically in previous investigations has signaled that perhaps he is either coordinating with Mueller, cooperating with him, or has cut a deal. And I do think that although they feel he cannot implicate him knowingly, perhaps there is something that Mike Flynn would say, whether it would involve the Comey firing decision or some other events that took place either during the campaign, during the presidential transition, or the early days of this administration, that might get the president in trouble, either on those obstruction of justice concerns or something unrelated that hasn't been reported yet.
And we'll definitely have to see how that unfolds. Jonathan, Donald Trump Jr. taking to Instagram, telling critics they're serving up nothing burgers with regard to his communication with WikiLeaks, and essentially telling his critics to bring it on. Jonathan, is this some sort of coping mechanism for him?
Maybe. You know, I'm not sure that any lawyer in the country would advise their client to go on Twitter and sort of poke the special counsel bear. You know, this is not behavior that is typical of somebody who's perhaps under investigation. Obviously, Donald Trump Jr. has talked to the Senate Judiciary Committee, and others have interest in him. So he's not doing himself any favors.
And Gabby, how do you think that the White House insiders are now reacting to President Trump's sparking a feud with Time magazine? And do you think that they can ignore that kind of stuff?
Well, President Trump has always had a penchant to comment on these types of things, and I do think that it's comical on the surface, but it is part of a growing concern that he isn't focused on the policy priorities that his administration has. He isn't focused on advancing his agenda. Instead, he wants to be in the middle of pop culture and be the commentator-in-chief, and that's something that's gotten him into a lot of hot water previously. And I know that Time is now pushing back on this, saying that the way that President Trump has portrayed the series of events is inaccurate. And so I think that this will be an ongoing feud, and I'm sure that it's going to overshadow tax reform heading into next week.
And the pushback was rather quick. Jonathan, what's your take on that?
I think that it's interesting and indicative of the president's sort of desire here, which is to be in the middle of the news. If you go back through the history of Time's Man of the Year or Person of the Year, it is not an award for the best person of the year, just generally speaking, the biggest newsmaker. And so there are some people who have done very positive things, some people who are a rogues gallery, but what's true of all of them is that they were the most important person in the news. And I think that's why President Trump wants people to know that Time is interested in him. I'm not sure how they could not be interested in him, whether or not he was actually going to win Person of the Year.
Interesting. Thank you. And Gabby, I want to turn to the White House's handling now of the Roy Moore sexual misconduct allegations, because Kellyanne Conway is now facing an ethics investigation for discouraging Alabamans from voting for Doug Jones during an interview this week. Is this the clearest indication of where President Trump and the White House now stand on these allegations?
Well, if you recall, about a week ago, Kellyanne Conway made an appearance on Fox and Friends, during which she said that it would be better, essentially, to have Roy Moore in the Senate than a liberal Democrat like Doug Jones. And President Trump echoed that same sentiment just days later when he was speaking to reporters before departing for Mar-a-Lago. So I do think that that is the stance of the White House. Whether or not they want to say that it's the official position is up for question. But I do think that that's, what this administration has been saying so far, that they would prefer to see Roy Moore, somebody who's under scrutiny for sexually assaulting, allegedly, a number of young girls in Alabama in the Senate than a Democrat, somebody who would likely vote against a lot of the president's policy priorities and most of his agenda.
And Jonathan, what is the latest on the impact that this is having in the race down in Alabama?
This is a really hard race to poll. It seems fluid. I was in Alabama a week or so ago, and I think there are a lot of Republicans there who are trying to figure out what to do. Is it that they ignore these allegations and vote for Roy Moore? Do they stay home? In some cases, do they vote for Doug Jones because they think this is too much to bear? And I think we're going to see over the next couple of weeks how that breaks. But Moore is certainly fighting hard. Doug Jones is fighting hard, and this is a much more competitive race than anyone expected in Alabama.
It might come down to the wire there. Gabby, on Thanksgiving, Senator Al Franken apologized again for his sexually inappropriate behavior, and he's set to speak with reporters tomorrow. Do you know anything more about tomorrow's event, and might it be part of his strategy as the ethics investigation gets underway?
Well, I think he has to be careful because this investigation is going to get underway soon here. But I imagine that this is just going to be another position where another press conference where he makes an apology, takes questions about these allegations, and reiterates that he has no intention of stepping down from his Senate seat, which is something that's put a lot of Democrats in a peculiar position because, you know, they've been calling for Roy Moore to be expelled from the Senate if he is elected. They've been having conversations about the validity of a number of these sexual assault allegations against Al Franken, and now they have a member of their party who's facing a lot of these criticisms and accusations. And so if he doesn't want to step down and has no intention of resigning, this is something that Democrats are going to have to answer for in the coming weeks.
Gabby, Jonathan, stick around because in a few minutes I will ask you about the confusion after the head of a government consumer watchdog group calls it quits and 2 people are named as interim directors. Also, striking back one day after a horrific attack on a mosque that killed more than 300 people, Egypt's military goes on the hunt for militants. Breaking news in Egypt, the number of people reported dead after a mosque attack has risen dramatically. Overnight, the death toll went up to over 300 people dead, including 27 children. NBC's Bill Neely is in Cairo, Egypt for us. And Bill, good morning. What is the latest on this tragedy?
Yeah, good morning, Dara. As you say, the death toll rising all the time. It's just over 24 hours since this attack took place. The death toll now put at 305, and as you say, 27 of them children. Truly horrific, not just the worst terror attack in modern Egypt's history, but one of the worst ever in the Middle East. It's a day of mourning here, but also of military response, with warplanes bombing what are described as terrorist targets. Fire at a mosque, a massacre without mercy, and mayhem after Egypt's death terror attack. Even ambulances targeted outside. Inside, more than 300 people dead, murdered as they prayed. Nearly all were men, but there were dozens of children among the dead and injured. More than 100 wounded, hundreds more traumatized. This morning, relatives took bodies away for burial. Entire families were killed after militants singled out the mosque in the town of Bir al-Abed, 200 miles from Cairo. A suicide bomber detonating inside the mosque, then gunmen, perhaps dozens of them, in 4 off-road vehicles, opening fire both inside and out on worshippers. Even by the deadly standards of the Middle East, this was a ruthless attack.
Islamic militants have been conducting attacks in the Sinai against Egyptian security outposts, but an attack against a mosque really crosses a new threshold.
The mosque is in Sinai province, now a virtual war zone, which ISIS is trying to take over. 2 years ago, in the skies over Sinai, ISIS brought down a Russian-bound plane using a bomb in a soda can, killing 224. This year, ISIS has attacked dozens of Christians, including inside a church. Attacks Egypt's security forces seem unable to stop. President Trump condemned the horrible and cowardly terrorist attack. Egypt's President Sisi says it makes him more determined to confront terrorism. And he sent in his bombers, warplanes destroying vehicles said to have been used in the attack and bombing what the military claim are terrorists in mountain hideouts. In Egypt today, deep shock at the massacre of so many civilians at worship inside a holy place by Islamist gunmen. Well, there has been no formal claim of responsibility, but no one here is in any doubt that the group responsible is the Sinai affiliate of ISIS. So a manhunt here today, 3 days of mourning, but a long-term problem for Egypt's President Sisi. He stands for stability and security. There is neither here. Dara?
Bill Neely reporting live for us from Egypt. Thank you so much, Bill. Let's get reaction now from the White House. NBC's Kelly O'Donnell is in West Palm Beach, Florida, where the president is spending Thanksgiving weekend. Kelly, good morning. President Trump tweeted that he called the president of Egypt. Any sense of what came out of that conversation?
Well, what's interesting about the Trump White House when you're looking at an incident like this, which has a global impact and really long-term diplomatic issues, you see two very different sets of responses. A formal response, what's described as a readout of the call between the President of the United States and the President of Egypt, where that went through the different levels of review before it was published. It describes the tone of the call from the President to President al-Sisi, offering condolences, conveying a shared partnership. Then you get the president's Twitter feed, which is a much more casual, much more shoot from the hip Donald Trump, who talks about those issues, but also links it to his own agenda for what's happening inside the United States. So a terror attack in Egypt may not have any direct impact on his policies domestically, but he finds that link. For example, he calls it a horrific and cowardly act. So he does speak in that sort of predictable tone, but he also says it is a sign of needing policies like a border wall or the travel ban. That, of course, not involving Egypt, but for his domestic political audience, and as a sign that if there is terrorism elsewhere in the world, he has a responsibility to try to protect the United States. So you get these two very different tracks on how the U.S. government responds. The formal sort of diplomatic sense through the official statement from the president and the White House, and then through the Twitter feed, a much more casual and yet reflective of the president's thinking on these issues when he talks about what he would like to see done and his connection reaching out to the president of Egypt. Dara?
Kelly O'Donnell, live for us from Florida. Kelly, thank you so much for that report. And tax bill wrangling, the maneuvering that lies ahead on Capitol Hill to get the bill passed next week. Now back to politics and a bit of confusion this morning about who was in charge of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. President Trump last night appointed Mick Mulvaney, the current director of the Office of Management and Budget, to serve as the agency's acting director. Well, the announcement came hours after Richard Cordray, the board's first ever director, officially resigned. Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren tweeted, "The Dodd-Frank Act is clear. If there is a CFPB director vacancy, the deputy director becomes acting director. Trump can't override that." Let's bring back Gabby Morangello and Jonathan Allen. And Gabby, let's start with you this time because Mick Mulvaney running both of these agencies. How is that allowed to work?
Well, first of all, poor Mick Mulvaney has a ton on his plate, considering both of these roles that he's now likely to play. But the Trump administration signaled early on that they really wanted to hollow out this agency, that they didn't think that it was doing a good job or that it was really carrying out what they would like it to be doing under this administration. And so I think that was the primary reason in putting Mick Mulvaney in this role as interim director of it. But it is causing some controversy because, as you mentioned, there are conflicting statutes here. One that dictates that the director of the CFPB would be allowed to appoint an acting director in his place due to a resignation, but then another that allows the president to appoint somebody to fill a vacancy, permitting that they are, if they are actually confirmed by the Senate in order to fill that vacancy during the interim. So there's a question here of who's going to play this role going forward until we have a permanent director, and I'm eager to see how this plays out.
Interesting. And Jonathan, what is Mulvaney's history with respect to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? Because wasn't he a critic of it in the past?
Not just a critic, he's called it a joke, a sad, sick joke. This is somebody who has long wanted to rein in or perhaps just dismantle the agency. Now he may be in charge of it. I think one thing we should do, Dara, though, is pull back the camera here a little bit, not literally, and just see what the interests are here. You know, Richard Cordray, the head of the CFPB, is widely rumored to be interested in running for governor of Ohio. He's leaving this agency, giving an opportunity for President Trump to name a successor to him, somebody who would dismantle it. That's going to get him hit by rivals for the Democratic gubernatorial nomination in Ohio. So here he puts in a replacement, says, I'm allowed to name the replacement, sets up a clash and a fight with the Trump administration, and I think that'll happen. Not to say that he doesn't believe that Mick Mulvaney shouldn't be the director, but it'll be interesting to see, as Gabby said, how this plays out legally. You saw in Elizabeth Warren's tweet, she said that the law is clear that a vacancy is filled by the deputy director. The law actually says an absence is filled by a deputy director, and I think this may come down to a question of whether Richard Cordray leaving that job open is an absence or a vacancy.
Which will be interesting for 2018. Gabby, I want to turn to the tax fight because President Trump is heading to Capitol Hill to meet with Senate Republicans on Tuesday and on another top priority issue. So what should we expect out of this meeting?
Well, I think that they're in that final push for tax reform, and they really want to get this done by Christmas, which is the deadline that the president has set for congressional Republicans. And there's still a lot of details of this Senate tax bill that need to be worked out before they bring it to a vote. So they're still talking about the corporate rate, whether they want to leave it at 20% or raise it by a couple percentage points or even a half percentage point. They're still looking at this child tax credit. They're still looking at a number of the other features of this tax bill, whether they want to consolidate the income tax brackets. And so there's a lot of questions and a lot of stakeholders and interest groups that are lobbying for different things, and it complicates this even further. And on top of that, it doesn't look like at this point that they would even have the votes among Republicans, forget Democrats for right now, but just among the Republican Party to get this through the Senate.
And Jonathan,
so many have come out.
Gabby, I got to wrap. Jonathan, yes or no, does Mitch McConnell have the votes?
Not yet.
Not yet. Jonathan Allen, Gabby Morangello, great to have you here on this Saturday morning. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that'll do it for me. I'm Dara Brown. Thanks for watching. At the top of the hour on Hugh Hewitt, author Ken Follett on his new book. But first, it's Your Business with J.J. Ramberg.